Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. I just wanted to correct, I'm not undertaking this transcreation project by myself. I'm mostly working on commentary, so that's what I'm going to be focusing on today. I wanted to just say, before I begin, the unique thing about this project is that, and I said this yesterday, but I found myself, after spending a work day working on a Pauri or two with Harinder Singh and the rest of the team, I found myself kind of exiting the work day and still thinking about these things, especially in the context of our current global political climate and all of the overwhelming and sort of horrible waves of nationalism that I think we're all trying to process. So I wanted to focus this presentation on how Guru Nanak Sahib would think about these things or talk about these things, the ways that I've related it to just current events and news happening all around the world, and also how all of this has very much challenged my own ideas about Guru Nanak Sahib that I've grown up with, and I think a lot of us have grown up with, as him sort of as this sort of mystical man who wandered the earth with his eyes half shut. So that's what we're going to do. So we're going to talk about the spiritual as political, and this is just a little overview. So we're going to focus on themes from three Pauris, 4, 5, and 6, and connect those to the personal and the political. So in Pauri 4, Guru Nanak Sahib talks about this command, which Harinder Singh had mentioned. He describes all of the things in nature and their place in this command. So a lot of cosmologies at the time, and even cosmologies now, create this hierarchy of existence, right? So you have gods and demigods, or you have the divine, and then you have millions of other gods who are avatars, and in Greek mythology you have similar situations. And then in society, even in non-religious terms, we create hierarchies amongst ourselves. We have the learned and the not so learned. We have casteism, we have racism, all kinds of fun things. So Guru Nanak Sahib says, as much as we create these hierarchies, he challenges that immediately, and he says there's no such thing as all of these different levels. There is the command with a big C, and then there's a smaller command. And there's many smaller commands on earth, whether it's political or spiritual or even sort of social norms that tell us what we should be doing with our lives, right? So he describes these things in nature, and he says, look around you. You know, the way that the sun rises and then the moon takes its place in the sky, or the way the wind blows, all of these things are happening in reverence of Ikonkar. So they're all happening in this command. And everything else is a distraction from that. So the main thing about this command with a large C is that it's accessible to everyone. There's nobody you have to go to, there's no room you have to sit in or pay to enter, no YouTube video you have to watch or Instagram influencer account you have to follow in order to get this wisdom and get in tune with that larger command. So this is what we're after, and this is what we're distracted by. He talks about the theatrics of the smaller commands. People who stand in a room and play on your emotions and sort of the transient nature of your emotions. So you can go in a room and listen to somebody say something really inspiring and then cry, and then in the end, you think that you're getting some sort of wisdom from it, but in the end, you're a little bit frustrated. And it feeds on your ego, too. So all of these sort of ideas that separate us from other people and enforce that hierarchy with the smaller command, those are things that feed into our senses of self-importance, or even our communal senses of self-importance as groups. So thinking about that, I just wanted to, oh, wrong clicker, okay. Thinking about that, I wanted to point to this line. Because I think a lot of times we think of our lives in terms of destiny. I think we love that word, especially I think a lot of like millennials are like, this is my destiny when they go after their dreams with certain jobs and stuff. And I understand that, but I wanted to talk about that in the context of this line, because that idea of your destiny being written on your forehead is familiar, and you can sort of see it in this line, but it's not about destiny, it's about command. So the difference that I wanted to point to between destiny and command is that destiny is about the individual, right? It's about doing whatever's sort of best for you in your context. And sometimes, in the case of like Hindu mythology, sometimes doing things that we as humans are like, why would that God do that horrific thing? But the command is not about the individual. And I wanted to make that distinction because I think in the context of, and I'm going to talk about Trump and Modi, just to let you know ahead of time, in the context of current politics and these sort of waves of nationalism and just like demagogues sort of taking over the rhetoric and feeding on those same things with their smaller commands, fear, ego, and anger a lot of times at people's own situations where they don't want to blame the people in charge, so they blame immigrants, for example. All of these things do play into that idea of destiny in some way. There are mythologies that we build around ourselves that can be dangerous, but I'll get into that a little later. I wanted to talk a little bit about Trump first, and then we'll just do a little transition into Modi. So I was thinking about Trump, and there he is. And I was thinking about him in the context of this entertainment. When you listen to like late night hosts talk about Trump and whatever rally he's done that day, they usually say like, oh, he killed at that rally. Like people loved it. A lot of times newspapers will say he played his greatest hits. Lock her up, build the wall, make America great again. Like these sort of phrases that play into people's sort of base fears, emotions, anger, and get them riled up. So I was thinking about Trump as this charlatan that Guru Nanak Sahib talks about in Asa Ki War, who tells people, he sells them some sort of mythology, right? He says, we had a time where we were great. And coincidentally, that time when we were great was a time when our population was not as colorful as it is now. And so people have these ideas that they feed off of, and he sells that to them. And I just want to do a little quick scroll through of some of his facial expressions, because when you look at them in stills, you realize that he's really a performer. So let's just check this out. A little bit of, yep, a little bit of this. And the thing is, we love it on some level. Even the people who don't agree with him, we're entertained by it. But then the question is, can you move past that transient feeling of entertainment or even empowerment, if you're a Trump supporter, and see it for what it really is? And then we get to Modi. So these guys are homies, to use a word that's a little too casual for the setting. So they had a Howdy Modi rally in Houston, and I think 50,000 people showed up to see them. And Modi is very similar to Trump in the same way that he sells a mythology. So Hindu nationalism is about this idea that our land is our land, and there's all these myths or history to some people, that occurred in certain places, and that gives us claim to these areas or these buildings or these places of worship, if we're going to talk about Pauri Masjid, which is like the never-ending argument. And the thing about Modi that I didn't know until I started looking up pictures of him is that he likes to wear costumes. So he'll visit a place and dress like the people that he's talking to. And it's pretty obvious what he's doing, maybe not to the people that he's talking to, but he's going to a place and putting on some garb and saying, listen, I'm going to sell you this idea, and I look a little more like you, and I'm going to convince you that it's your destiny as a Hindu person to propagate this Hindu nation. And I'm going to create enemies out of minorities, and I'm going to tell you they don't belong here. And you're going to walk away feeling empowered because I've let you I've fed on your ego in some way. So I wanted to put this one up because I wasn't sure if a lot of people knew about this, but this is him in Punjab, if you haven't guessed. He's taken our, I guess, he would call it a costume. It's not a costume, but for him it is. And he's infused it with saffron so that we've become a part of his narrative. And then I just couldn't put all of them up, so there's a little montage for you. And this is like a deliberate thing that he's doing. It's very much a strategy. This isn't just him saying, oh, I'd love to. I accept wearing this thing that you all see as near and dear to your hearts. It's something that he's put a lot of thought into. And I wanted to talk about command with the smaller c as some kind of myth building. And myth isn't always dangerous, and we'll get into ways that myth can be positive. But I was reading about what exactly the BJP and the RSS and just all of this Hindu nationalists, all these organizations, what they're doing in terms of creating myths around themselves to propagate their ideas. So there's a journalist who studies sort of the way that they go about doing that, and I'm just going to read this because I think it's important. So the first and most obvious is that all these organizations operate on myth building. They always position themselves against an enemy that doesn't exist, mainly minorities and specifically Muslims, and through that positioning call themselves champions of Hinduism. That's first. Second, through legitimizing violence, aggression, hooliganism, and sometimes raising militant armies, their cadres are meant to believe that they are working for the nation, when in truth, what they do is against the nation. They present themselves as champions of Hinduism. They present themselves as people who are propagating this Hindu destiny in the subcontinent. And for that reason, there are so many people who are suffering who fall for that because they know that they're like playing in on those emotions. Well, they don't know, but Modi's playing in on those emotions in the same way that the middle class in middle America feels that Trump speaks to them in some way because there's anger at their situation, but not at the right people. And that's something that's really deliberate, and we see it throughout history. So Guru Nanak Sahib tells us that theater, he actually warns us. He says, you know what, if you want to go to your rally or go to your play and enjoy that theater play for a little while and enjoy that rhetoric or that narrative, fine, be entertained, that's fine. But when you leave that room and that transient feeling is gone, then what do you have other than frustration or anger? So that's 44. And then 45, he talks about how these things cause us to go in circles. So all these things that distract us from the command maybe situate us in some way in time, because the command with the capital C is eternal. But the command with the lower c is very much existing in time. And if you exist in time and space and you're thinking about land and all of these things, you're losing sight of the oneness of Ek Onkar, and you're separating yourself from other people. So Guru Nanak says, and I have both up here, the italics didn't translate, but this is part of the Guru Granth Sahib project. So the first is a literal with parentheses, where there's no literal word, and then the second is interpretive. So I wanted to share a little bit of that work with you. But he says, devoid of wisdom, the world is deceived in this play. Jamkal, the fear of death, has and continues to eat away at the world. So when we're distracted by all of these things that are around us, telling us that we should be angry or we should be scared or we should blame it on this person or that person, we lose sight of sort of being centered in that oneness, in Ek Onkar, and being able to see everyone as part of it. And it's not just seeing it and being like, ah, yes, the divine in me recognizes the divine in you. That's not enough. It's even when you're surrounded by all of this rhetoric, how do you center yourself to not fall into those influences and those sort of traps? So then I wanted to point to sort of a theme of Salok 2 in this 40. Guru Nanak Sahib talks about all the different things that spin. He lists all these things that spin and go in circles sort of endlessly. And the way that I usually thought about this, I think in the context of my sort of like post-grad millennial life, not in the political sense, was, oh yeah, we're going in circles all the time. We talk about the rat race. But then in the context of politics and history, we always talk about the circular nature of history. We talk about history repeating itself all the time. And even in a way that's sort of frustrating. We're watching things happen again and again, and we're wondering why nobody's doing anything about it. But then everybody seems to be wondering that and not doing much. So there is this sort of, I think, the way that I would read it is that Guru Nanak Sahib is saying, yeah, it's not just that you as an individual are going in circles, it's even that the events that are happening around you, they're going to continue to go in circles until we can sort of break out of this distraction. So this is just another line that gets into that. So in the context of our day-to-day lives, yes, it can mean going in circles, but it also means what are you doing to break out of that? Are you recognizing what command you're under? Because a lot of times I think we talk about freedom and we say, well, I live in a democracy and so I'm free. And so we have these illusions of freedom that we sort of convince ourselves of. Maybe that's a little bit of personal myth building that we do. And when we do that, I think we lose sight of the fact that there's things that we should be questioning, taking issue with, speaking up against, in the same way that Guru Nanak Sahib did. So the last Pauri that I'm going to touch on is 46. And I'm going to take it back to that same journalist who studies RSS and the BJP and all of their strategies. So the theme of this Pauri, I would say that I took away from it in the context of the current events all around the world, is that the spiritual and the political are intertwined. So Guru Nanak Sahib is not just criticizing political leaders, he's not just criticizing spiritual leaders or questioning them or questioning religious status quo versus spiritual status quo. He's saying, actually, those two things they're buddies and they work together. So there are people who think that they're free. He talks about how Muslims get into Sharia and there's all these things rules that we make for ourselves, and he said, well, they're not free. But then there's spiritual people who think they're free because they don't have the same sort of concrete rules, but they have rituals in the same way that trap them. So he very much talks about how these two things are intertwined. And you see it in US politics we have the National Prayer Breakfast, where Christians who are trying to propagate a certain vision of how the United States should do their policy, a lot of it is very homophobic, they have influence on US policy. They have a dinner with all these political leaders where they get to influence that actively. And in the case of the RSS and Modi and the BJP, there is very much an intertwining of those two spaces. And you see that even like sadhus and babas are now becoming political leaders, put there by the BJP. And they're influencing voters to vote for the candidates that they've been told to influence people to vote for. So none of this is, able to be separated. But I wanted to read this too because I think that this is really important. So a lot of it has been written about how the RSS operates in political space. We also know that the RSS's ability to influence the political space depends largely on its ability to utilize religion for its political purposes. But our understanding regarding how the RSS operates in religious space is very limited. Unless you understand how it operates in the religious realm, you will not be able to understand exactly how it is able to manipulate the public space, or the political space. So, I mean, we see this all the time. There's friendships between the spiritual and the political leaders because they're two sides of the same coin. And they take advantage of the people, and devoid of wisdom, as Guru Nanak Sahib said, we tend to just sort of fall for it. So then the question is, like, what am I supposed to do with this overwhelming information and just sort of the state of affairs all around the world? And I think that's where this has been really helpful for me, thinking through these things that are happening all around the world. Guru Nanak Sahib says there's 3 things you can do and that you should do if you're serious about it. So there's nam-identification, identifying with Ik Onkar in a way that's more than just saying, I understand we're all one. Because if you really understand that we're all one, and I'm not there yet, obviously, I don't think a lot of us are, but that pain that you see all around the world that Harinder Singh was talking about earlier, you feel it. I think there's moments where we separate ourselves even from the people we want to be empathetic towards because we don't know how to deal with it in a way that feels active and productive. So it's not just identifying with Ik Onkar in all the things around you, in all the people around you, especially the people that are suffering. It's also praising Ik Onkar and adopting good behavior. So changing your behavior inside is actually how you get free. It's not about who's granting you freedom or even what politician you put into place technically, because that's not eternal. The eternal thing that you can sort of, I guess, center yourself on is Ik Onkar and the command with a capital C, because that will be here long after we're gone, and it was here long before we came. I think the thing I wanted to end on was something from Nikki Ganinder Kaur Singh, who talks about Nam, because we talk about Nam as inspiration, and when your cup is overflowing with his inspiration, that's when you have to figure out where you want to spread that. So it's not just about learning a bunch of stuff and then leaving and saying, I learned something, and then changing nothing about anything that you do in the world. So I'm not going to read this whole thing because I think it's a little bit dense, but to sum it up, she basically says that to be loving in your actions and to be inspired in your actions through Nam is a courageous act. So a lot of times we talk about love and we talk about Guru Nanak Sahib and we're like, he was this passive guy. But even in calling out Babur, even in calling out corruption, there's an underlying loving thing happening there where he's demanding better of this oneness, of all the people that are a part of this oneness. And that message of wisdom and this idea of the eternal command is supposed to be accessible to everyone. It's not just supposed to be for Sikhs or Punjabi Sikhs even. It's supposed to be for everyone, especially the people that are suffering. So I've talked about this a lot because I feel like sometimes I learn a lot of things, especially on the job, and then I'm like, what am I supposed to do with all this? I still feel frustrated about the world and still very much emotionally affected. But you have to get past that and then say, okay, now what can I do? And I'm not going to tell you what to do because everybody's going to do different things. Like I'm not going to sign you up for some sort of activist group. But there are things that you can do that are small. Calling out injustice where you see it. Involving yourself in activism, even though that's not the whole picture. Involving yourself in those things is better than just doing nothing. Better than just saying, wow, it's horrible that they're separating children from their parents at the border. I feel sad about that. And then that's it. And then the one other thing that I wanted to say about going back to this myth idea and back to Guru Nanak Sahib as sort of this visionary that we talk about, comes from Joseph Campbell, who writes a lot about myth. But this is from a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. So he says, there's nothing wrong with this sort of idealistic way of thinking about how things can be. We haven't gotten there yet, but there's nothing wrong with trying your best to aspire to that. So he says, we must reclaim the visionary, the utopian, the dream of the better or happier world. These are not childish or lies. They are the transcendence of men and women, the loss, hurts, realization of mortality we all face, and then celebrate the present life moment also. So I think there is something revolutionary even in aspiring to that and demanding better of your communities, big and small. And in the context of the political sphere, that means centering yourself with Nam so that with all these things happening around you, you're able to sort of see straight. So yeah, I think I'd like to end on that. Thank you.